Death on the Orient Express line, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage of Carriage. 7. The train departed Vienna at precisely 7 minutes past 8 in the evening, and already Hercule Poirot had formed his opinion of the passengers in carriage 7. He sat in the dining car nursing a tisane, a beverage which the steward had produced with admirable reluctance and considerable bewilderment, and observed. This was, after all, his primary occupation. Not the asking of questions, not the dramatic flourish of accusation, the observing, the filing away of small, telling details which others walked past as one walks past wallpaper. The Orient Express, or rather, this particular incarnation of its spirit, the Balkan Continental Limited running the Vienna to Istanbul route, was not quite so glamorous as its predecessor. It was, however, populated with precisely the sort of people Poirot found most instructive, those who had money enough to travel in comfort, but not enough to travel without anxiety. At the table nearest the frosted window sat a man of perhaps 55, broad-shouldered and silver-templed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. Lord Edmund Ashworth. Poirot had noted the name from the passenger manifest, which he had studied with characteristic thoroughness before boarding at Brussels. Lord Ashworth's hands rested upon the tablecloth, with the stillness of a man suppressing agitation. He had ordered whisky twice before the train had cleared the outskirts of Vienna. Across from Ashworth sat a woman who was emphatically not his wife. This Poirot deduced not from any impropriety in their manner. On the contrary, they were conspicuously formal with one another, but from the particular rigidity with which they avoided each other's eyes. A man and his wife, even an unhappy man and his unhappy wife, have established rhythms of inattention. These two were performing inattention, which is quite a different matter. The woman, dark-haired, perhaps 35, handsome in the severe architectural style of a woman who has been told she is handsome so often she has ceased to believe it, was introduced in the passenger list as Miss Celeste Vorland, occupation unspecified, nationality French. Behind them sat a young man of perhaps 28 who radiated the particular misery of someone travelling against his will. He was fair, thin, with the kind of face that would have been called sensitive in a previous century and anxious in the current one. Mr. Thomas Kell, British, listed as private secretary, to whom the manifest did not specify. Poirot noted that he checked his wristwatch with the frequency of a man who needs to be elsewhere. The compartment furthest from the dining car contained, according to the steward, a talkative Bulgarian named Georgi, who had accepted Poirot's appreciation of good listening without much encouragement, an elderly Hungarian countess named Marta Fekethazi, who had boarded at Vienna with 11 pieces of luggage, and a Persian cat that was emphatically not permitted. The countess had resolved this prohibition by placing the cat inside her largest hat box and referring to it, when it mewed, as a music box with irregular mechanics. There was also Dr. Heinrich Brandt, a German physician of about 45, quiet and contained, who had spoken to no one at dinner and read a medical journal throughout the soup course with the focused attention of a man deliberately not looking at someone nearby. That someone, Poirot had concluded after 7 minutes of observation, was Lord Ashworth. And finally there was Mrs. Irene Ashworth, the actual wife, who occupied a separate compartment from her husband and had taken her dinner early, alone, and departed without speaking to anyone. She was 60 perhaps, or a hard 58, with the kind of eyes that have watched a great deal and decided that commentary is wasteful. Poirot sipped his tisane and allowed the gentle rocking of the train to settle around him like a familiar coat. He was travelling to Istanbul at the invitation of a Turkish collector who wished him to evaluate the provenance of several acquired antiquities. A curious, but not unpleasant commission. He had no particular interest in the passengers of carriage 7 beyond the natural interest he took in all human arrangements. He reminded himself of this firmly as the train plunged into the first of many mountain tunnels and the dining car fell briefly, completely dark. When the lights returned, a matter of perhaps 4 seconds, Thomas Kell had gone very pale, and Dr. Brant was looking at his hands. Poirot set down his tisane. The evening, he felt, was not yet finished with him. He retired to his compartment at 10:30. The steward Georgie turned down his bed with professional efficiency and informed him, unprompted, that Lord Ashworth had requested a second bottle of whisky be sent to his compartment at 10 o'clock, and that Miss Vorland had walked the length of the train twice before dinner and once after. "You are an observant young man," Poirot told him. Georgie smiled with the careful neutrality of a man who knows his observations are worth more than his salary. "On a long journey, monsieur, one sees everything." Poirot nodded. He lay in his narrow bunk and listened to the train breathe and sway through the mountain darkness, and he thought about the particular quality of Lord Ashworth's stillness, and Miss Vorland's performed inattention, and the pale face of young Thomas Kell in the moment the lights came back on. He slept, eventually. He was a man who valued sleep as one of the great aids to the little grey cells. At 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, something woke him. Not a sound, or not precisely a sound. Rather, the cessation of a sound. The train had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed to the creeping pace of a locomotive, consulting its conscience in the mountains of Serbia. And beneath the sound of the changed engine rhythm, Poirot heard something else. A door closing, 3 compartments distant, with the care of someone who did not wish to be heard. He lay still in the darkness and listened to the train think. By morning, Lord Edmund Ashworth was dead. Chapter 2. The Gentleman in Compartment 4. He was found at 6:43 in the morning by Georgie the steward, who had brought the lord his requested breakfast of toast, black coffee, and a hard-boiled egg, a combination which Poirot privately considered barbarous, but characteristic of the English aristocracy's complicated relationship with self-punishment. Georgie knocked twice, then a third time with more conviction. Then he used his steward's key, because the regulations permitted it, after 3 unanswered knocks between the hours of 6 and 9, and because the coffee was growing cold. Lord Ashworth lay on his back on the narrow bunk, fully dressed in his evening clothes, his arms at his sides with a precision that struck the steward as immediately wrong. The wrongness was not the position, which might have been achieved by a very tidy sleeper, but the colour of the face, a deepened, suffused purple red, that spoke not of sleep, but of its permanent alternative. Georgie backed out of the compartment with admirable self-control and went directly to find the train's conductor, a stout Czech named Václav Horak, who took one look through the doorway and sent for the doctor. Dr. Brant arrived in his dressing gown, examined Lord Ashworth with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has seen death before and respects its requirements, and delivered his conclusion to Conductor Horak with the measured gravity of an expert witness. "He is dead. The time, I would estimate between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. The cause I cannot state with certainty without proper examination. However," he paused, and Poirot, who had appeared in the corridor in his immaculate dressing gown and monogrammed slippers with the unhurried air of a man who wakes early by nature, caught the hesitation with interest. "However, the colouring in the position suggests the possibility that this was not a natural death." "The possibility," Conductor Horak repeated carefully. "The strong possibility," Dr. Brant amended. Poirot stepped forward into the doorway. He had not been invited, but in his experience, the moment of invitation is frequently too late for the observations that matter. The compartment was tidy to the point of staging. The whisky bottle, the second one, requested at 10 o'clock, stood on the small fold-down table, uncorked, with approximately 1/3 of its contents remaining. A single glass stood beside it, with the residue of a measure at the bottom. Lord Ashworth's jacket was draped over the chair, with the care of a man who kept good habits. His shoes were placed neatly beneath the bunk. His cufflinks, heavy gold with an insignia Poirot did not immediately recognize, rested on the small shelf beside the window, but his tie was still knotted imperfectly at his throat. A man who takes off his jacket and shoes before lying down does not keep his tie on. He removes the tie first. It is the instinct of comfort. Unless he had not removed it, unless someone else had replaced it, badly. Poirot's eyes moved to the window. It was latched from the inside. He noted the latch with particular attention. "Monsieur Poirot," said Conductor Horac, who had been informed of his passenger's identity with the mingled respect and wariness that Poirot's name routinely produced in men of official position. "I am told you investigate. I am on holiday," Poirot said pleasantly. "However, I am also here, which is perhaps the more relevant fact. I wonder, Conductor, if you might persuade the passengers of Carriage 7 to remain available this morning. It would be most helpful." Horac looked at the dead lord on the bunk and made the calculation of a man weighing professional obligation against supernatural expertise that has arrived, conveniently, in a dressing gown. "I will do so," he said. The train was not stopped. Stopping would require a communication to the Serbian authorities, would produce a delay of unknown duration, would require— Horac outlined this with the efficiency of a man who has rehearsed the logistics of catastrophe, the involvement of officials whose involvement was historically unpredictable. The train would continue to Belgrade, the next scheduled stop, where the matter would be properly reported. And in the meantime, Horac said, the passengers must not be alarmed. "They will be alarmed," Poirot said with gentle certainty. "They will be very alarmed. The question is not whether they are alarmed, but whether they are alarmed usefully." He returned to his compartment, dressed with his customary care, the suit pressed, the moustaches attended to with the waxed comb, the shoes gleaming, and sat for 10 minutes with his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together, considering what he had observed. The whiskey glass with one measure remaining, the tie replaced inexpertly, the window latched from inside, the time of death, midnight to 3, and the sound he had heard at 2:20, the careful closing of a door 3 compartments distant. Lord Ashworth's compartment was 3 compartments from his own. He opened his eyes. In the corridor, he could hear the train beginning to wake. Footsteps. The murmur of Georgie's voice explaining something in 3 languages simultaneously. A door opening, then closing quickly. The particular silence that follows the transmission of terrible news. Somewhere, 3 compartments away in the social geometry of Carriage 7, a murderer was also preparing for the day. Choosing clothes, perhaps. Composing an expression. Deciding what to say when asked where they had been at 2:20 in the morning, when a door closed too carefully in the mountain darkness. Poirot adjusted his tie in the small mirror above the wash basin and permitted himself, very briefly, the private expression of a man who finds a problem interesting. Then he went to speak to the widow. Chapter 3. The widow's still waters. Mrs. Irene Ashworth received him in the compartment she had made her own, with the instinct of a woman who has long understood that territory is everything. A small travelling case was open on the bunk, revealing layers of silk and wool that spoke of money, carefully maintained. A book lay face down on the fold-down table, a history of Byzantine art, which Poirot noted. Beside it, a cup of tea, barely touched. She herself sat in the single chair with her hands folded in her lap, wearing a dark blue travelling suit that was not quite mourning, but was sufficiently sombre to suggest she had anticipated, at some level, that a darker shade might become necessary. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiness of a woman who had made certain decisions before he knocked on her door, and Poirot found this interesting rather than incriminating. Grief takes many forms, and the form that looks like composure is not the least genuine. "Madame Ashworth," he said, "please accept my most sincere condolences." "Thank you." She gestured to the edge of the bunk. "Sit, if you like. I imagine you have questions." "I always have questions, madame. It is the affliction of my nature." He sat, folding his hands over his knee. "You and your husband occupied separate compartments. We have done so when travelling for the past 7 years," she said. Edmund snores. Was a practical arrangement. "Quite. And you did not see him last night after dinner?" A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. "I saw him in the corridor at approximately 9:30. We spoke for perhaps 2 minutes." "About what, if I may ask?" "About nothing of consequence. He mentioned the scenery. I mentioned that I found my compartment cold. We said good night." "And you heard nothing unusual during the night?" "No sounds from his compartment, which is, as I note, not far from yours." Mrs. Ashworth looked at him with eyes that were measuring and not unkind. "I take a sleeping tablet when I travel, Monsieur Poirot. It is another practical arrangement. I heard nothing after 11 o'clock. Poirot nodded gently. "Your husband had been drinking last evening. The steward, Georgie, brought him a second bottle of whisky at 10 o'clock. Edmund drank heavily when he was anxious," she said. "This is not a revelation. And what was he anxious about, madame, on this particular journey?" The hands in her lap shifted, the smallest adjustment, as if redistributing weight. Edmund was always anxious about something. For the past several months, I believe it was financial. There were difficulties, investments that had performed poorly. He was not a man who managed uncertainty with grace. Was he acquainted with any of the other passengers in this carriage? Dr. Brandt, perhaps? Miss Vorland? The young man Kell? Something moved behind her eyes, a fleet, complex thing that was gone before it fully arrived. I could not say what acquaintances Edmund maintained. The evasion was beautifully done. Poirot appreciated skill even when deployed against him. "A last question, madame. The cufflinks in your husband's compartment, heavy gold, with an insignia. A bird of some kind, I thought. Do you know them?" For the first time, the composure showed a hairline fracture. "I don't. They were his. I don't know every piece of his jewellery." "Of course not," Poirot agreed pleasantly, and rose. "You have been most helpful, madame. I will not trouble you further at present." In the corridor, he paused outside her closed door and allowed himself a moment of stillness. She had not asked how her husband died. She had not asked whether it was illness or accident or something worse. She had answered questions about his anxieties, his drinking, his acquaintances, with the careful selectivity of a woman who knows already that it is something worse, and has decided which truths to offer and which to set aside. This told Poirot one of two things. Either Mrs. Irene Ashworth had killed her husband, or she knew who had and had made her calculation. Either way, she was not finished being useful to him. He walked the length of the corridor, noting the compartment arrangement by the feel of numbers and positions. Ashworth in 4, Mrs. Ashworth in 6, Miss Vorland in 3, between Ashworth and the dining end, Thomas Kell in 7, Dr. Brandt in 2, nearest the corridor door, the Countess Fekethazi in 8, farthest from everyone, with her illegal cat and her music box explanations. The sound of a door closing at 2:20, 3 compartments from his own in compartment 1, meant it was compartment 4, Ashworth's own door, or 3, or 5. 3 was Miss Vorland, 5 was unoccupied. So the sound was either Lord Ashworth's own door, a man going out, or someone leaving, or it was Miss Vorland's compartment. Poirot moved toward compartment 3 and knocked with 2 precise knuckles. Leicester-Morny. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Walked Twice. Miss Celeste Vorland opened the door in a dressing gown of deep green silk, and the expression on her face told Poirot everything and nothing simultaneously. It was the expression of a woman who has spent a lifetime preparing for moments of confrontation and has become so skilled at the preparation that the expression itself is the mask, and the mask is the message, and the message is, "I am calm, I have nothing to hide, and we both know I am lying." "Monsieur Poirot," she said, in French-accented English of particular precision, "I was expecting someone to come. You were expecting me specifically?" "I was expecting someone. Please come in." The compartment was not disarranged, but it had the quality of a room in which sleep had not properly occurred. The pillow held the impression of a head that had tossed. The blanket was folded at the foot of the bunk with the neatness of someone who had given up on it. On the small table, 2 empty coffee cups. She had rung for the steward not once but twice during the night. "You did not sleep well, mademoiselle." "I never sleep well on trains. The motion disturbs me." She sat on the bunk and folded her hands, and looked at him with the direct assessment of a woman used to being looked at who has decided to reverse the transaction. "Lord Ashworth is dead." "That is so." "How?" "That," Poirot said, taking the chair, "is precisely what I am attempting to determine." "You knew him, Mademoiselle Vorland." "Not a question." She recognized it and did not attempt the denial that a simpler woman might have tried. "Yes, I knew him." "Well?" A long pause, filled with the sound of the train over tracks and the distant clatter of the dining car beginning its breakfast preparations. "Well enough," she said finally. "We met in Paris 2 years ago, at a gallery opening. He collected art, did you know? Byzantine mostly. He had considerable expertise and no taste whatsoever, which is not uncommon in collectors." The words were precise and not kind, but underneath them was the ragged edge of something that had been, once, less clinical. "You were lovers," Poirot said. She did not flinch. "We were, for approximately 8 months. It ended 14 months ago. Not without difficulty." Another pause. "He was not a man who accepted endings gracefully. He continued to pursue you. He continued to believe that sufficient money could resolve any situation," she said, "including situations which are not, fundamentally, about money." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And on this train? You are here because—" "I am here because I am travelling to Istanbul to visit a friend," she said. "I did not know Edmund would be on this train. Or—" She hesitated, and in the hesitation, Poirot saw the shape of a decision being made. "Or I did not know until 4 days ago, when a mutual acquaintance mentioned it. And by then my ticket was purchased and I chose not to alter my plans. I refuse to alter my plans for a man who has already taken more from my calendar than he deserved." "Did you speak to him aboard the train?" "Briefly. Before dinner. He came to my compartment uninvited and we spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. The green of her dressing gown caught the morning light and turned her expression to something that might have been sorrow, or might have been the landscape's reflection. He was agitated, more than I had seen him before. He wanted—" She stopped. "What did he want, mademoiselle?" "He wanted me to corroborate something. A story. He said there were people on this train who were dangerous to him, and that if anyone asked, I should confirm that we had discussed, at a gallery in Paris 2 years ago, an artwork whose provenance he had personally verified." She looked at Poirot with perfect steadiness. "The artwork does not exist. He wanted me to lie for him. And did you agree?" "I told him to leave my compartment," she said. "Which he did, and that was the last I spoke to him." Poirot rose slowly. "One more thing, mademoiselle. The steward observed you walking the length of the train twice before dinner and once after. And I believe, forgive me for being direct, that you left your compartment during the night." The pause this time was shorter but deeper. "I could not sleep," she said. "I walked to the end of the corridor and back at approximately— I didn't look at my watch, perhaps 1 o'clock, perhaps later. Did you see anyone?" "The corridor was empty," she said. She met his eyes without wavering. Either she was telling the absolute truth, or she was the finest practitioner of the absolute lie that Poirot had encountered in recent years, and he had encountered several. He thanked her and went to find Thomas Kell. Chapter 5. The Secretary's Particular Terror. Thomas Kell was not in his compartment. Poirot found him at the far end of the corridor, standing at the window that looked out onto the Serbian mountains, scrolling past in the early morning light, grey and massive and indifferent. He was dressed but unshaven, and the shaving was a detail that interested Poirot. The young man was the type to shave, the type for whom the morning ritual of appearance was a form of psychological armor, and the fact that he had not, this morning, suggested either extreme haste or extreme distress. "Mr. Kell," Poirot said. The young man turned, and his face confirmed the distress hypothesis. He was not merely pale, he was the colour of a man who has recently understood something terrible. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I know who you are. Lord Ashworth mentioned you. This was interesting." "Oh? In what context?" Kell glanced down the corridor with the involuntary anxiety of a man who has been looking over his shoulder for some time and has made it a reflex. "He said, last week, before we boarded, he said if anything happened, I should find someone reliable, someone who could not be bought. He mentioned your name." Poirot regarded him with careful attention. Lord Ashworth anticipated that something might happen to him. Lord Ashworth was terrified, Kell said, and the word came out with the force of long containment. "I have worked for him for 3 years. I have never seen him frightened of anything. He was not a gentleman, Monsieur Poirot, and he was not a good man in the ways that perhaps matter most. But he was brave, after a fashion, physical courage at least. And for the past 6 weeks he has been frightened in a way that was—" Kell shook his head. "It changed him. You are his private secretary?" "I was, yes. I managed his correspondence, his appointments, his financial communications." A hesitation on the last word that Poirot filed carefully. "He had considerable business interests. Madame Ashworth mentioned financial difficulties." Kell's jaw tightened briefly. "Mrs. Ashworth is not fully informed about the extent of those difficulties." Poirot allowed the silence that followed to sit between them for a moment, comfortable and expectant. "Lord Ashworth had been involved," Kell said finally, his voice dropping though there was no one within 20 feet, "in an arrangement that had gone very wrong. Approximately 18 months ago he entered an agreement with certain parties connected to the trade in Eastern European antiquities. The agreement was, to put it plainly, fraudulent. Documents were forged. Provenance was manufactured. A number of very wealthy buyers in London and Geneva acquired pieces that were not what they were sold as." Poirot thought of the Byzantine art history book on Mrs. Ashworth's table, and of Miss Vorland's account of the artwork that did not exist, and of the cufflinks with the insignia he had not recognized. "And Dr. Brandt," he said. Kell stared at him. "How did you—" "I did not know," Poirot said simply. "But you have just told me." The young man pressed his hand briefly over his face in the gesture of someone recalculating their position. "Dr. Brandt is not. He is not only a physician. He represents, I believe, the interests of the parties who feel they were insufficiently compensated in the arrangement. Lord Ashworth had diverted funds that were meant to be shared. He had intended, I believe, to use this journey to reach Istanbul and certain banking connections there that might allow him to relocate assets before anyone could act. And who else knew this? On this train." Kell looked at him with the exhausted eyes of a young man who has been carrying information too heavy for one person. "I don't know. I know that Lord Ashworth was frightened of Dr. Brandt. I know that Miss Vorland, he mentioned her too, though I don't know her connection fully. And I believe—" He stopped, looked out at the mountains, looked back. "I believe that someone on this train was sent specifically to ensure that Lord Ashworth did not reach Istanbul." Poirot nodded slowly. It was, he reflected, becoming a complex picture. Complex, but not without pattern. The patterns were there. They always were. "Mr. Kell, where were you last night between midnight and 3 in the morning?" "In my compartment," he said. "Awake. I couldn't sleep either. I heard, at some point, I'm not sure what time, I heard movement in the corridor. Footsteps. I didn't look out." "Why not?" Kell looked at him with the first honest simplicity of the conversation. "Because I was afraid of what I might see." Chapter 6. The Cufflink and the Countess. The Countess Marta Fekethazi received Poirot with the magnificent graciousness of a woman who has been receiving people in inconvenient circumstances for 7 decades. She was ensconced among her considerable luggage like a particularly well-dressed archaeological site, and the Persian cat, a large, disapproving creature of silver-grey colouring, occupied the foot of the bunk with the authority of a magistrate. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending a hand weighted with rings. "I have been expecting the famous detective. Please move that hat box and sit." Poirot moved the hat box, which mewed faintly, and sat. "Madame la Comtesse, I hope the night was not too distressing." "I am 81 years old," the Countess said, with the serenity of someone for whom that fact is simultaneously credential and armour. "I have survived 2 wars, 3 husbands, the Revolution, and a very bad oyster in Marseille. A death on a train is not distressing, it is merely inconvenient." She fixed him with eyes of astonishing sharpness. "He was murdered, of course. What makes you say so?" "Because men like Edmund Ashworth do not die of natural causes at 57. They die of consequences." She said this with the certainty of a woman who has known a great many men like Edmund Ashworth, and found them, on the whole, to be their own worst enemies. "I knew him, you know. Not well, but I know of him. His family were involved in Hungarian property arrangements after the war that my family found characteristically inconvenient." "Ah," said Poirot, "you need not be delicate, monsieur. I did not kill him. I am 81, and my reasons for wanting Edmund Ashworth dead are 50 years old. The statute of resentment, I have found, expires eventually." She scratched the Persian cat with absent affection. "What I can tell you is what I saw." Poirot became very still. "Please. I am an old woman and I sleep badly. I was awake most of last night. The cat also had views about the mountain tunnels. At approximately 2:10, I looked through the small gap in my compartment door. I leave it very slightly open for the air, a habit from my country houses, and I saw someone in the corridor." "Could you identify who?" "Not the face. A figure, moving quietly toward the dining car end. Away from Ashworth's compartment, you understand. Moving away from it, not toward it." She paused for effect, and Poirot respected the timing. A tall figure, a coat or dressing gown, dark, and she reached into the fold of her travelling blanket and produced, between 2 ringed fingers, a small object. This was on the corridor floor this morning. Outside my door, I thought it might be of interest. It was a cufflink, heavy gold with an engraved insignia, a bird with spread wings, an eagle, or possibly a phoenix. Poirot took it with extreme care. He turned it in the light. It matched, precisely, the cufflinks he had seen in Lord Ashworth's compartment, except that both cufflinks had been on the shelf beside the window in Ashworth's compartment when he had looked this morning. He closed his fingers around it gently. "The figure you saw, Countess, moving away, toward the dining end. Could you say anything further? Height, build?" "Tall," she said, "broader than the young secretary, more the build of the doctor." She said it without accusation, as a measurement. "Or, possibly, a woman in a bulky robe." "You have been most helpful, Madame la Comtesse." "I know," she said pleasantly. "I always am." Edmund Ashworth and his kind have been a particular sort of trouble in Central Europe for 100 years. If someone has arranged his removal, I am not in principle opposed, but I should like it done cleanly and correctly, and mysteries left untidy on trains are bad for everyone. Kindly solve it, monsieur." Poirot regarded the cufflink in his palm as he returned to the corridor. Here was a thing that should not be. A cufflink from Ashworth's collection, found outside the Countess's door at the far end of the corridor from Ashworth's compartment. The Countess was in compartment 8, Ashworth in 4. If the cufflink had fallen from the person the Countess saw, moving away from 4 toward the dining end, then it had been carried from 4 to beyond 8 and dropped somewhere between by someone who had been in Ashworth's compartment, who had handled Ashworth's cufflinks. The tie, replaced badly. The cufflinks on the shelf, one now here. a person reconstructing the appearance of a man undisturbed who had missed one small detail. Poirot put the cufflink in his breast pocket and thought about Dr. Heinrich Brandt, who had looked at his hands when the lights came back on in the tunnel, and who had given his estimate of the time of death with the particular precision of a man who already knew the answer. Chapter 7. The Doctor's Careful Hands. Dr. Brandt was a man of method. His compartment demonstrated this. The medical journal precisely aligned with the edge of the table, his coat hung with military straightness, his case, a physician's black bag of old-fashioned quality, fastened and placed beneath the bunk with the exactness of a man who likes his tools accounted for. He received Poirot's knock and opened the door with the expression of a man who has been expecting an examination and has prepared for it thoroughly. This, too, was a tell. The innocent are startled, the guilty are braced. The particularly intelligent guilty are neither. They are composed, cooperative, and they offer information before it is requested. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I have been hoping you would come, please." His German-accented English was precise and careful. He sat on the edge of his bunk with his hands rested, open, on his knees. A deliberate gesture, Poirot thought. Open hands, transparency. "You conducted the initial examination of Lord Ashworth," Poirot said. "I did, in my professional capacity, at the request of the conductor." He met Poirot's eyes directly. "I should tell you immediately that I had a prior acquaintance with Lord Ashworth, which I perhaps should have disclosed to the conductor, but in the distress of the moment. You know Ashworth through the antiquities business," Poirot said. A pause, the faintest recalibration. "You are well informed." "Yes, I was. I am. A representative of a group of Munich-based collectors who entered into an arrangement with Lord Ashworth approximately 18 months ago, an arrangement which proved to be fraudulent. Lord Ashworth misrepresented provenance documents. He took significant funds from several parties and failed to deliver authenticated pieces as agreed." "And you identified him on this train?" "I identified him when I boarded in Vienna. He had not expected to see me. I could see that in his face." Brandt's voice remained measured, but something beneath it vibrated at a frequency that was not quite calm. "I had not expected to see him either, I confess. I knew he was attempting to reach Istanbul. There were rumors that he intended to access certain funds deposited there before anyone could pursue legal remedies. So you confronted him. I attempted to have a conversation with him. He refused. He was," a thin pause, "dismissive. He believed that if he could reach Istanbul, the legal mechanisms available to my clients would be insufficient." Brandt looked at his open hands. "He may have been right." "Dr. Brandt," Poirot said, with the quiet pleasantness that his suspects had learned, "always too late," was the inflection that preceded the most dangerous question. "Where were you between midnight and 3 o'clock this morning?" "In my compartment," he said. "I took a sedative at 11. I have difficulty sleeping when I am professionally involved in a distressing situation, such as travelling in the same carriage as a man who has caused considerable harm to people I represent. I took a quarter grain of a preparation I use." He reached into the black bag beneath the bunk, unfastened it, and produced a small brown pharmaceutical bottle. "If you wish to verify." "Thank you." Poirot examined the bottle with apparent interest, then returned it. "You said, this morning, that Ashworth's colouring suggested he did not die naturally. What specifically suggested this?" Dr. Brandt paused for what Poirot estimated was 1 second longer than pure professional reflection required. "The suffusion of the face, combined with the position, the arms too precisely positioned for natural collapse. When a man dies of cardiac arrest in his sleep, he is rarely so arranged." "Precisely so," Poirot agreed. "And the cause, in your professional opinion?" "Without laboratory analysis, I cannot say with certainty. The symptoms I observed are consistent with several agents: cardiac glycoside toxicity, digitalis or similar, would produce exactly this presentation. It would also, I should note, be exceedingly difficult to trace without specific testing, and such an agent, Poirot said pleasantly, would be available to a physician. The room was very still. Outside the window, the mountains had gentled into lower hills, and the light had the quality of mid-morning. To a physician, Brant said, with perfect control, and to anyone with access to certain common plants, certain readily available preparations, or indeed to the internet. He held Poirot's gaze. You will find, Monsieur Poirot, that my medical bag contains nothing of the kind. You are welcome to examine it. Poirot declined with a small gesture. He had already noted that the bag was clean, arranged, and had clearly been organized very recently. The instrument's positions had the slightly too deliberate alignment of a man who has gone through his own belongings and satisfied himself that they are beyond reproach. Whether this meant innocence or thoroughness, Poirot had not yet decided. Chapter 8. What the Whiskey. Told Poirot returned to Ashworth's compartment with the conductor's reluctant permission and stood for 6 minutes without touching anything, simply looking. The whiskey bottle, the single glass, the tie knotted at the throat of a dead man who had removed his jacket and shoes but kept his tie on, the cufflinks on the shelf, one remaining now where two had been, the window latched from inside. He crouched and examined the floor with the small magnifying glass he kept in his breast pocket beside a handkerchief of exactly 4 folds. The carpet was the dark burgundy of railway carriages throughout history, designed to conceal the evidence of travel. But near the door, in the pile of the carpet, there was a faint disturbance, a smear, not a stain, consistent with a shoe sole pressed at an angle. Someone who had stood in the doorway and shifted their weight. He examined the whiskey glass with particular attention. The liquid residue at the bottom had dried slightly, as residues do overnight. There was, he noted, a faint particulate matter at the very base of the glass, nearly invisible, the ghost of something dissolved. He did not disturb it, but he photographed it with his small camera, which he had kept with him since the Belgian days, a habit he had never relinquished. He stood and examined the cufflinks. One remained, the eagle or phoenix in heavy gold. He turned it against the light. The workmanship was Eastern European, probably Hungarian, probably pre-war. A family piece, then, or a purchased affectation of family. The insignia was a specific heraldic design. He replaced the cufflink carefully. He thought about what the scene was telling him versus what it was trying to tell him. A dying man, arranged to look as though he had lain down and simply ceased. A whiskey glass with something dissolved in it. A window latched from the inside, which eliminated entry from outside but did not eliminate the bottle having been tampered with before Ashworth poured his own measure. A tie not removed, suggesting the arrangement was hasty or performed by someone unfamiliar with the specific habits of English gentlemen at their leisure. And a cufflink gone, and then found outside the Countess's door. The cufflink nagged at him, not because of what it was, but because of what it suggested about the person who had dropped it. A person who had been in this room, who had handled the cufflinks, both of them, not merely one, and who had, in leaving, retained one inadvertently. A cufflink falls into a pocket. A cufflink falls from a hand. It does not fall from a surface unless it is picked up. Why pick up a dead man's cufflinks? He stood very still in the compartment and let the question sit in his mind, and after a moment the answer came, not as a revelation but as the inevitable resolution of a logical sequence. Not both. 1. Someone had found one cufflink already missing and had taken the second, to complete a pair, or to prevent its identification, or to return it to someone from whom it had come. A gift, perhaps, an identifying object, something whose presence in a dead man's room required explanation, which meant someone had taken the second cufflink and had then dropped it in the corridor, and the Countess had found it. The cufflink originally belonged not to Lord Ashworth, but to someone who had given it to him, or left it with him, or, more darkly, lost it in his compartment during an earlier, less fatal visit. Poirot left the compartment and went to find Georgie, the steward. Georgie was in the small service area between carriages, preparing the lunch trolley with the focused efficiency of a young man who has decided that the performance of normal duty is the most stabilizing response to catastrophe. "Georgie," Poirot said, "the cufflinks which Lord Ashworth was wearing when he boarded at Vienna, did you notice them?" Georgie considered this with the seriousness of a man who had been noticing. "Yes, monsieur. He had. At dinner, he wore different cufflinks, smaller ones, silver, with a blue stone, not the gold ones." Poirot paused. "He changed cufflinks between dinner and later?" "I did not notice the gold ones until this morning," Georgie said. So Ashworth had silver cufflinks at dinner and gold ones in death. The gold ones were not his, or were not his usual habit. They had been placed on him, or placed near him, by someone who had brought them, or taken them from another context. The insignia, the Hungarian heraldic design. Poirot thought of the Countess Marta Fekethazi, and the 3 dead husbands, and the property arrangements that had inconvenienced her family. And then he thought of something else, of the way she had produced the cufflink from her travelling blanket, between 2 ringed fingers, with perfect timing. He was, he thought, not quite seeing the whole picture yet, but the outline was becoming visible. Chapter 9. Dinner in the Dark. The train reached the outskirts of Belgrade at 12:30, and conductor Horak held a careful conversation with the Serbian railway authorities that resulted in a delay of 2 hours and the presence of a local inspector named Radovic, who wore an impressive moustache and had the bearing of a man who has been summoned to an international complication and is managing his feelings about it with professional dignity. Inspector Radovic interviewed each passenger in Horak's office car with the thoroughness of official procedure, and Poirot sat in the corridor outside and listened to the cadences of the conversations with the patience of a man who is collecting not content but hesitation, not answers but the shapes of the pauses before answers. He had by this point a structure in his mind, not a certainty. Poirot was too careful for certainty before it was warranted, but a shape, a geometry of guilt that required only a few more measurements to resolve into something definite. After Radovic had finished his interviews and conferred with Poirot at some length, with the cautious respect of a man who knows he is outclassed but is too professional to be resentful about it, Poirot made 2 discoveries that brought the geometry into sharper relief. The first was from the dining car steward, a different man from Georgie, who handled the evening shift. He recalled, when asked with sufficient specificity, that Miss Vorland had ordered a mineral water at dinner and had, for a period of perhaps 8 minutes, been at the table alone while her dinner companion, a woman who had sat with her briefly, not one of the carriage 7 passengers but a woman from carriage 5, had gone to the facilities. During those 8 minutes, a whisky had been sent from Miss Vorland's table to Lord Ashworth's table, at Ashworth's request, by the waiter. The second discovery came from young Thomas Kell, who, under the gentle, persistent pressure of Poirot's attention, admitted that he had not, in fact, remained in his compartment all evening. He had gone to Lord Ashworth's compartment at 11:30, at Ashworth's own summons, and had spent 40 minutes with him in agitated conversation. The subject of this conversation was a document, a specific financial document detailing certain transfers, which Ashworth wished Kell to destroy on his behalf. "And did you?" Poirot asked. "No," Kell said. "I refused. And he," a long pause, "he threatened me. He said he had evidence that I had been complicit in certain transactions, which was partially true, I think. I did not fully understand what I was assisting with until much later." "What was his condition when you left him at midnight or shortly after?" "Alive," Kell said, with the emphasis of a man who understands the weight of the word. "Alive, angry, and drinking. Had he had anything from the dinner trolley? Any food brought to the compartment? Yes, he had a whiskey sent from the dining car. He poured it when I arrived. It was already in the compartment, in a carafe-style glass. He offered me some and I declined. He poured from a carafe, a single-serve carafe, the kind the dining car uses. It was already open. Poirot sat with this for a very long moment. The dining car sends whiskey in a single-serve carafe. The carafe is sealed when it leaves the kitchen. By the time it reached Ashworth's table, or compartment, it was already open. 8 minutes at a table alone. A carafe of whiskey. A woman who had walked the length of the train 3 times. He went to find Miss Vorland for the 2nd time, and this time he did not proceed gently. Chapter 10. The web between Vienna and Istanbul. She knew, when she opened the door, that the gentle part was over. He saw it in the slight adjustment of her expression, the performance dropping 1 layer, revealing not guilt precisely, but the face of a woman deciding how much truth is necessary. "The whiskey," Poirot said, without preamble. She stepped back. He entered. "Sit down, mademoiselle." Not as an invitation, as a suggestion from someone who wishes this to be conducted with dignity. She sat. The green silk dressing gown was gone. She was dressed properly now, in dark wool, as if she too had made preparations for a particular quality of conversation. "You ordered a whiskey at dinner," Poirot said, "and had it transferred to Lord Ashworth's table. But before you sent it, during the 8 minutes you were alone at your table, you introduced something into it." "That is a very serious accusation," she said. "It is a serious situation. The residue in Lord Ashworth's glass is consistent with a dissolved preparation. The glass was a dining car glass, not a compartment glass. It was never returned. Ashworth brought it with him from dinner to his compartment, or had it brought. He drank from it. He died." Miss Vorland looked at her hands. "You cannot prove this." "Not here, on a train," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "In a laboratory. The residue in the glass, which I have preserved, and any remaining substance discoverable about the relevant substances, will provide proof sufficient for a court. But I am not, at this moment, interested in courts. I am interested in understanding." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, Belgrade station was visible, the platform with its handful of officials and onlookers, and then the train began to move again, departing into the afternoon. "He destroyed me," she said finally, and the word was very flat and very particular. Not the affair. The affair was stupid, and I accept responsibility for my own stupidity. But when I ended it, he used what he knew about my work. I have a small gallery in Paris, Monsieur Poirot, which deals in Eastern European art, to implicate me in his schemes. He provided my name to certain collectors as someone who had verified documents I had never seen. He forged correspondence in my name. By the time I discovered what he had done, my professional reputation was substantially damaged. And the legal recourse, he had enough resources, for long enough, to make any legal action extraordinarily costly. And he had the documents. He could produce fabricated documents that made my involvement look worse than his. Poirot regarded her. "And yet you did not kill him for revenge," he said. "That, I think, is not quite right. Tell me the rest." She looked at him sharply. "There is more," Poirot said. "The cufflinks, the Hungarian heraldic design. Tell me about the Countess." The silence stretched. Then, very slowly, she said, "The Countess Fekethazi's youngest granddaughter is my closest friend. The Countess's family were among those whom Ashworth's property schemes damaged most severely. We have been in contact over the past year. She knew about my situation. I knew about hers. We were both on this train, and we had discussed." She stopped. "You had discussed the possibility," Poirot said very quietly, "of taking action, and you divided the responsibilities between you." He reached into his breast pocket and placed the cufflink on the table between them. The Countess provided this cufflink, a family piece from the estate Ashworth's family connections had appropriated, to be placed in his compartment after death, a signature, a message to those who would understand it. And you, he looked at her steadily, provided the means. Miss Vorland looked at the cufflink. Are you going to tell them? She asked. The inspector, the authorities? I am going to tell you, Poirot said, what I know, and then I am going to think very carefully about what I understand. These are not always the same thing. Chapter 11. The Gathering in the Dining Car. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with the train running through the Bulgarian countryside, under a pale winter sun, Hercule Poirot asked conductor Horak to gather the passengers of carriage 7 in the dining car. They came with the varying expressions of people who know that a gathering of suspects by a famous detective means the approach of revelation. Thomas Kell sat nearest the window with the rigid posture of a man bracing for impact. Dr. Brandt arranged himself with professional composure at the far end, hands folded, face controlled. Miss Vorland sat in the centre, very still, in the dark wool that gave her the gravity of someone already prepared to stand in judgment. Mrs. Irene Ashworth took the chair directly across from Poirot, with the specific composure of a woman who has been in difficult rooms before and knows how to inhabit them. The Countess Fekethazi, who required assistance navigating the corridor, arrived last and settled herself with magnificent unhurriedness. The Persian cat apparently secured, for once without any hat box. Poirot stood at the head of the dining car in his immaculate suit, and the afternoon light from the Bulgarian hills came through the windows and lay across the white tablecloths, and he waited until everyone was settled and the silence was complete. I thank you all for coming, he said. I will be, if you will permit me, direct. Lord Edmund Ashworth was murdered. He was poisoned with a preparation introduced into his whisky at the dinner table. The poison, a cardiac glycoside compound, caused death between 1 and 3 o'clock this morning. He observed each face, Kell's jaw tightening, Brandt's stillness deepening, Vorland's hands pressing once together and then releasing, Mrs. Ashworth's expression, which was not surprise, the Countess's eyes, which were very bright and very sharp. I will now tell you what happened, he said, and I will ask only that those who know the truth to listen carefully, and those who do not know the full truth to listen even more carefully, because I intend there to be no misunderstanding. He walked, slowly, the length of the dining car and back. Lord Ashworth was a man of considerable talent applied consistently toward harmful ends. He was a fraudster in several jurisdictions. He was a manipulator of people's professional and personal trust. He had damaged, through forgery and deception, the financial and reputational standing of numerous people, including several in this carriage. He stopped at the head of the car again. Dr. Brandt represented those clients. His presence on this train was not coincidental. He had known of Ashworth's travel plans and had arranged to be on the same train, with the intention of confronting him and, if possible, securing certain assurances or documentation before Ashworth reached Istanbul and placed his assets beyond reach. Brandt's expression did not change. Thomas Kell was Ashworth's secretary and had been, knowingly and unknowingly, involved in certain transactions. He was on this train at his employer's instruction, and he was frightened, correctly, about his own position. Kell looked at the tablecloth. Miss Vorland's history with Lord Ashworth I will not detail at length. She had suffered substantially at his hands. The Countess Fekethazi, whose family history with the Ashworth connections is extensive and well documented, was also on this train. The Countess inclined her head with the gracious acknowledgement of a woman receiving a correct attribution. And Mrs. Ashworth, Poirot said, turning to the widow, was on this train because her husband was on this train, which is perhaps the simplest explanation of all. Mrs. Ashworth met his eyes without flinching. Now, said Poirot, the question is not only who killed Lord Ashworth, but what is to be done about it. These are, in my experience, separate questions that require separate consideration. Chapter 12. The Shape of Justice. The dining car was very quiet. Outside, the Bulgarian countryside rolled past under the thinning afternoon light. "I have spent this day," Poirot said, "examining evidence. I have examined a whiskey glass with a residue in it. I have examined a cufflink from a Hungarian estate. I have examined a compartment arranged with the tidiness of theatre rather than the disorder of natural death. I have spoken with each of you, and I have arrived at a complete understanding of what occurred." He pulled a chair to the head of the table and sat, which was unusual. Poirot preferred to think on his feet, but the sitting was deliberate. It changed the register of what followed from performance to reckoning. The plan was not spontaneous. It was not the result of a moment's passion or opportunity. It was the result of careful coordination between two people who had, independently, suffered harm at Ashworth's hands, and who had, together, decided that the harm would stop. He looked at Miss Vorland and then at the Countess. The preparation was introduced into a single-serve carafe of whiskey during the 8 minutes that Miss Vorland was alone at the dinner table. The carafe was then transferred, at Ashworth's own request, to his table and subsequently brought to his compartment. Ashworth poured his own glass. He administered the poison to himself, in the most literal sense. He drank what was offered with the complacency of a man who believed he had nothing to fear from women. Neither Vorland nor the Countess spoke. The cufflinks, the Hungarian heraldic cufflinks belonging to the Feketházy estate, were placed in Ashworth's compartment by someone who entered after his death and before the steward's morning visit. The Countess had observed the corridor at 2:10, which was, I believe, the return journey, not from Ashworth's room, but from the Countess's room, where the plan's next stage was being confirmed. Mrs. Ashworth made a small sound. Not surprise. Something else. "The window," Poirot said, "latched from the inside. This is the element that puzzled Inspector Radovich, who assumed it argued against murder. But the window was never the entry point. The door was. Ashworth's door was accessible by steward's key, and the key was not only the steward's. The conductor carries a master. A determined person might also produce, in the appropriate circumstances, a copy. He looked at Kell. When Ashworth summoned you at 11:30, he unlocked his door to admit you. He may not have locked it again after you left." Kell said, very quietly, "I don't know if he locked it. I heard him slide the bolt, I thought, but I cannot be certain." "Then there is no certain locked door," Poirot said. "There is only a door that someone entered through and dressed a dead man's throat and placed a family cufflink and left, dropping a second cufflink in the corridor outside the Countess's room, where it was found this morning." "You said 2 people planned it," Dr. Brandt said, with the controlled attention of a man who is following closely and not without interest. "What about the rest of us? Myself, Mr. Kell, Mrs. Ashworth. We each had motive." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "This was not accidental. Motive was distributed carefully, deliberately, I think, across the passengers of carriage 7. Ashworth had wronged a remarkable number of people. The configuration of this journey meant that any investigation would face a multiplicity of suspects. This was understood." He looked at Mrs. Ashworth. "Madame, you knew." The widow looked back at him for a long moment. "I suspected," she said. "There is a difference." A pause. "I took my sleeping tablet at 11 o'clock, Monsieur Poirot. I heard nothing after that." "And you did not inquire this morning how your husband had died," Poirot said. "Because you had reached a conclusion that did not require the answer." She said nothing. Her hands in her lap were absolutely still. "I will not," Poirot said after a moment, "press that particular point further." The dining car was very quiet. The train moved through the last of the Bulgarian afternoon, and the light was going gold and low. Chapter 13. The little grey cells deliver their verdict. "You will wish," Dr. Brandt said, with careful precision, "to know what I intend to tell the Turkish authorities when we arrive in Istanbul." "I know what you intend to tell them," Poirot said. "You intend to tell them that Lord Ashworth died of cardiac arrest, in your medical opinion, as the physician who conducted the initial examination, and that there is no evidence to the contrary. This is what you intend to say." Brant looked at him steadily. "And would I be wrong?" "Wrong is not the word I would choose," Poirot said. "The residue in the glass will require laboratory analysis. Whether that analysis is requested depends on whether Inspector Radovich files a report that prompts it, and on what that report contains." He looked around the table. "I am going to tell you something that I do not often say, because it runs contrary to certain principles by which I have spent my professional life. Hercule Poirot believes in the law. He believes in justice administered through proper channels, with evidence, with procedure, with the protections of the accused and the rights of the wronged. He has spent 40 years believing this." The train rocked gently over a series of points, and the window light shifted. Lord Edmund Ashworth forged documents. He stole from clients. He destroyed professional reputations through fabricated correspondence. He used his financial resources to prevent legal remedy. He was using this journey to remove his assets beyond any jurisdiction that might have stopped him. He was, in the technical sense of the word, untouchable by the mechanisms I believe in. Silence. The woman who placed the preparation in his whiskey suffered at his hands over years. She watched her professional reputation, built through work and expertise and honest endeavour, systematically dismantled by a man who thought that sufficient money could resolve any situation. The Countess Fekethazi, he looked at the old woman, who received his gaze with complete steadiness, is 81 years old, and has watched a family's history be gradually appropriated, piece by piece, by men whose successors Ashworth embodied completely. He stood. "I am not the law," Poirot said. "I have never confused myself with the law. I am a man who discovers the truth. What is done with the truth is another matter, and it is not always mine to determine." He walked to the window and stood with his back to them for a moment, looking out at the hills. "The Turkish authorities will receive a report from Inspector Radovich. What that report contains depends on what Inspector Radovich concludes. The inspector, I believe, is a competent and thorough man, who will note that the only physician present gave a preliminary opinion of cardiac arrest, that there is no certainty of anything else, and that the deceased had a history of heavy drinking and cardiovascular strain, which, I understand, is medically documented." He turned. "I have not told the inspector about the whiskey glass. I have told the inspector that there are several individuals in this carriage with financial grievances against the deceased, which is information he already had from his own interviews. I have told the inspector that the deceased was travelling under circumstances of considerable personal stress." Thomas Kell looked up. "You're not." "I am explaining," Poirot said, "what I have and have not done. I am not asking for your opinions about it. This is, and remains, an unusual position for me, and I am not wholly comfortable in it, and I will not pretend otherwise." He met Miss Vorland's eyes, then the Countess's, then Mrs. Ashworth's. "I have, however, one condition," he said. "One thing I require before I leave this dining car." Chapter 14. The Condition and the Crossing. They looked at him, 5 faces, representing 5 varieties of involvement and 5 variations of relief that had not yet fully declared itself. "The financial documents," Poirot said, "the records of Ashworth's fraudulent arrangements, the forged correspondence implicating Miss Vorland, the evidence of transactions in which Mr. Kell was involved, knowingly or otherwise. These things exist somewhere, in Ashworth's belongings or in other locations." He looked at Kell. "You mentioned a document he wished you to destroy." "It's in his briefcase," Kell said. "In his compartment. I didn't destroy it. It's a record of certain transfers. It implicates me, but it implicates others more significantly." "Then it will be produced," Poirot said, "through appropriate channels. Whatever legal remedy is available to the people Ashworth defrauded, Whatever recourse remains, the documentation will be given to the appropriate authorities, not the Turkish authorities on a train platform, the appropriate authorities in the appropriate jurisdictions. British, French, German, Hungarian, Mr. Kell. Kell nodded. It was a nod of a man who recognizes a rope thrown into a pit. Yes, he said. Yes, I can arrange that. Miss Vorland, the forged correspondence in your name. Ashworth will have retained copies. For leverage. Where? She was quiet for a moment. He told me he had them in a London deposit box, but I believe, from what I've learned of him, there may be copies in his personal files. He kept everything. His personal files will be examined by his estate. His estate? Poirot looked at Mrs. Ashworth. Madame, you are his heir, I assume. I am, she said. You will have access to his files. I am asking you to ensure that any materials relating to fraudulent transactions, forged documents, or the professional reputations of others are made available to counsel engaged by those parties. I am not asking you to incriminate yourself. I am asking you to ensure that what can be corrected is. Mrs. Ashworth looked at him for a long time. Her eyes, which had watched a great deal and decided that commentary was wasteful, were now considering a different kind of economy. Edmund was not a good man, she said finally. I knew this. I chose not to know how thoroughly, which is not the same as innocence, but it is also not the same as complicity. She paused. Yes, I will ensure it. Poirot nodded. He looked at Dr. Brandt. Your clients, doctor, have lost funds. They may, through the documentation that Mr. Kell will provide, have some recourse, less than they deserve, more than they would have had if Ashworth had reached Istanbul. That is true, Brandt said, with the careful acknowledgement of a man who is making a calculation and arriving at an acceptable number. And the Countess, Poirot said, turning to the old woman, who had sat through the last 30 minutes with the imperial patience of someone for whom time is a different substance than it is for the rest of the room. The cufflink, your estate's property, I believe, returned to your family in a roundabout fashion. He reached into his breast pocket and placed it on the table before her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and held it, and closed her hand around it with a completeness that was neither triumph nor grief, but something quieter and older than either. My grandfather's, she said simply. Poirot looked at them all once more, and then he walked to the window and watched the light change over the approaching darkness of the Turkish hills. I am a man who has found, over many years, that the law is the best available instrument of justice. It is imperfect. It is slow. It is available to those with money in ways it is not available to those without. I have always believed it nonetheless. He turned. Today, on this train, I have been asked to decide whether what I believe is more important than what I know to be true, which is that a man who was beyond the law is dead, and that the people who ensured this are not, on balance, the primary authors of the harm in this carriage. He was quiet for a moment. I am not at peace with this. I want to be clear about that. Hercule Poirot is not at peace with it, but Hercule Poirot is also old enough and has seen enough to know that peace and correctness are not always the same country. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair and put it on with the precision of a man reclaiming himself. When we reach Istanbul, you will each attend to the things we have discussed. I will attend to my commission regarding certain antiquities, and then I will return to London, and I will think about this case for a very long time. He looked at Miss Vorland last. Mademoiselle, the preparation you used, do you have any remaining? She met his eyes. No, she said. It's in the Danube. Good, said Poirot, and he left the dining car. Chapter 15. Istanbul in the morning. The train pulled into Sirkeci station at 7:30 in the morning, and Istanbul received them with the immensity of a city that has been receiving travellers and their complications for 2,000 years without particular surprise. Poirot stood on the platform in his coat and hat and watched the passengers of carriage 7 disperse, as passengers always disperse, the particular solitude of people who have shared an enclosed space under extraordinary conditions and are now resuming the separate trajectories of their lives. Thomas Kell departed carrying a briefcase that was not his own, Lord Ashworth's, taken with the permissions of Mrs. Ashworth and the conductor, containing the documents that would, in the coming weeks, be delivered to 3 sets of lawyers in 3 countries, and would initiate proceedings that would take years to resolve, but would ultimately provide something approaching remedy to a significant number of people. He was, Poirot thought, a young man who had made poor choices under the influence of a powerful employer and who had, on a train between Vienna and Istanbul, made a better one. Whether this would be sufficient, the courts would determine. Dr. Brandt departed with his black bag and his medical journal and his contained expression, and the final report he filed with Inspector Radovich, which Poirot had not seen but understood, was precise and carefully worded, and concluded that Lord Edmund Ashworth had died of acute cardiac failure, consistent with the subject's known history of heavy drinking and elevated stress, with no evidence of external cause. The inspector, who was a competent man, accepted the doctor's expertise and documented his own conclusion accordingly. The Countess Fekethazy required 4 porters and considerable organisation to disembark with her 11 pieces of luggage and the Persian cat, who had progressed from hat-box to shoulder bag and was regarded by the Istanbul customs official with the diplomatic unrecognition that international travel sometimes demands. The Countess pressed Poirot's hand at the platform gate with the gravity of a woman transferring something more than warmth, and said only, "You are more interesting than I expected, monsieur." "You are considerably more interesting than I expected, Madame la Comtesse," Poirot replied, and meant it entirely. Miss Celeste Vorland was the last to leave the platform. She had walked toward the station exit and then stopped, and turned back, and found Poirot still standing where she had left him. "You would have continued," she said. "I need you to understand that. Not because I need your absolution. I have made my peace with what I did in the way one makes peace with things that are not entirely peaceful. But I need you to know that the calculation was correct. He would have reached Istanbul, and he would have continued, and there would have been others." "I know," Poirot said. "It is why I am standing on a train platform in Istanbul, rather than accompanying you to a police station." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Will you think about it?" she said. "As you said, for a long time." "For the rest of my life, I suspect," he said honestly. She nodded once and walked through the station gate and was gone into Istanbul. Poirot stood on the platform as the station noise settled around him. The calls of porters, the hiss of the next departure, the enormous indifferent life of a great city doing its ordinary morning. And he thought about Lord Edmund Ashworth, who had been a man of talent and cruelty, and had died in his compartment on a train at 2:20 in the morning, with the precision of a prepared solution. He thought about the law, which he believed in. He thought about justice, which he also believed in, and about the space between them, which was sometimes very small and sometimes as wide as the Bosphorus. He thought about the little grey cells, which had done their work impeccably and arrived at a truth that did not, in this instance, feel entirely like satisfaction. Chapter 16. The Philosopher on the Bridge. 3 days later, Poirot stood on the Galata Bridge in the late afternoon, watching the waterway traffic pass beneath him in the flat winter light. His commission regarding the antiquities had been completed to the collector's satisfaction and to Poirot's own moderate interest. 3 of the 7 pieces were genuine, 2 were competent forgeries, and 2 were of uncertain origin that would require further scholarship. This was, he reflected, a reasonable proportion of genuine to false, and not unlike the distribution one found in most collections of human character. He had a small notebook in his coat pocket, and he had written in it, over the past 3 evenings, his account of the case. Not for publication, not for submission to any authority, for himself and for the particular discipline he imposed on his own thinking, which was that a thing properly understood must be properly recorded. The case, as he understood it, Lord Edmund Ashworth, 57, British peer, fraudster, and manipulator, had boarded the Balkan Continental Limited at Vienna in the possession of significant documentation of his own crimes, intending to reach Istanbul and place his assets beyond the reach of anyone he had wronged. Miss Celeste Vorland had learned of his travel plans 4 days before departure. She had communicated this to the Countess Fekethazi, whose family she was connected to through her friendship with the Countess's granddaughter. Together, they had formed a plan which required only the proximity that the closed world of a railway carriage provided. The preparation, a concentrated digitalis glycoside, which Poirot had confirmed was consistent with the residue in the glass, though he had not submitted this confirmation to any authority, had been carried by Miss Vorland and introduced into the single-serve whisky carafe during the 8 minutes she was alone at the dining table. The carafe had been sent at Ashworth's own request. The cufflinks from the Fekethazi estate, pieces that had been transferred under duress in arrangements that bore Ashworth family fingerprints, had been placed in Ashworth's compartment by the Countess, who had entered after the poison had done its work, using a copy of the master key she had obtained through means she had not explained and Poirot had not pressed her to. The tie had been straightened by an old woman in the dark, imperfectly, because one cannot quite see the knot in the darkness without risking the light. The second cufflink had fallen from the Countess's hand in the corridor outside her own compartment. Old hands, Poirot reflected, do not always close as securely as they once did, and she had chosen to produce it to him, rather than explain its disappearance. She had calculated, correctly, that Poirot would find it useful to know what she had found, and that offering it to him was the more controlled of the two options. She had also calculated, correctly, that Poirot would find the situation as a whole complicated. He stood on the Galata Bridge and watched a ferry pass beneath him, and he thought about complication. He was a man who had spent his life in the service of truth and order. He had stood in rooms and named murderers and watched them led away, and he had felt, each time, the particular satisfaction of a mechanism correctly engaged, the truth revealed, the harm acknowledged, the law informed. He did not feel this now. What he felt was something more uncomfortable, more interesting, and considerably less convenient. He felt the weight of a case that had resolved into clarity, perfect, complete, logical clarity, and produced not satisfaction, but a question. The question was not whether Miss Vorland and the Countess Fekethazi had killed Lord Edmund Ashworth. They had. The evidence was conclusive, and the confession, in its way, had been offered, in pieces, over the course of a day's conversation on a moving train. The question was about the nature of justice, when justice has been distributed unfairly for long enough that the law and justice have come to point in different directions. Poirot did not have an answer. He did not expect to find one on the Galata Bridge, or in Istanbul, or perhaps anywhere. He had, instead, the thing he had told Miss Vorland he would have, a case to think about for a very long time. The light on the water was going gold and flat, and the calls of the ferries and the distant sound of the city at evening gathered around him, and Hercule Poirot, the greatest detective in the world, stood on a bridge between two continents and understood that the greatest cases are not the ones that end in a courtroom, they are the ones that do not end at all. He put his notebook in his pocket. He straightened his coat. He looked at the water for 1 moment longer, with the expression of a man who has solved everything and resolved nothing, and found this, despite himself, more interesting than the alternative. Then he turned from the bridge and walked back into the city. Thus concluded the matter of the Balkan Continental Limited, November, in the year of which we need not speak precisely. The case was never brought before any court. The documentation provided by Thomas Kell resulted, 18 months later, in civil proceedings in 3 jurisdictions and partial restitution to several parties. Dr. Brandt's report remains, in the official Serbian and Turkish railway records, the last word on Lord Edmund Ashworth's cause of death. Hercule Poirot returned to London, to his flat, to his tisanes and his symmetrical flat-fronted shoes, and he thought about the case, as he had said he would, for a very long time.